Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be talking about how training a certain way was holding me back. Training like a pussy, quote unquote pussy. I don't mean that as an offensive way. I know we're in 2024, but that's a term I think a lot of us are aware of. And it's a thought that's come into my mind over the last couple of years, especially as people have asked me like, Steve, you have been training now 15 years plus, and I continue to see some improvements in my physique where other people would think you've kind of quote unquote hit the natty limit or whatever, which I don't agree with that premise anyway. But essentially the thought of how have you continued to make improvements? And one of those is quite literally just doing the same thing, continuing to do the big rocks that we know create growth, training hard, training with plenty of volume, making my body get to high levels of stimulus with also high levels of fatigue, backing off and then going again. Like some of these big principles of progressive overload, specificity, good exercise selection, plenty of volume, plenty of frequency, but within my recovery limits until I can't recover and then backing off and going again. Some of these elements that we rinse and repeat that you guys have no doubt heard tons about in depth. But something I have changed is really my thought process surrounding trying to create a stimulus and generate it in a muscle. And one of those is no longer training as quote unquote easy as I used to, and just allowing myself to be a bit more resilient, if you will. So I'll dig into some elements of things that I've changed my mindset around. First is failure. Now, Martin Refalo, who's been on the Revive Stronger podcast, if you don't listen to the podcast, please do, because it's amazing. And I have guests on who are doing PhDs in looking into the relationship between proximity to failure and muscle growth, such as Martin. And he discussed kind of like within the literature, the term failure is mixed in terms of different terminologies. So one of those being technical failure. So when form breaks down, that's when you've hit failure, versus momentary muscular failure. You hit a concentric rep that you can't complete. And so that's kind of momentary muscular failure. And then with like volitional failure, when you feel like you failed, that's when you failed. And so there's like some room for like margin of error there, right? The way I now think about failure is I want to take an exercise safely for the muscle that's being targeted to failure. So what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to take that muscle as close to failure as I can. Again, new literature coming out, but I think we all kind of knew this. The closer do we get to failure, there seems to be better growth. And so it's really important, one, to train muscles close to failure, and two, now and then like getting that muscle as close to failure as possible. So one of those things is picking exercises that allow you to train the target muscle as close to failure as you can. So for example, when I would squat and I'm trying to grow my quads, I'd get loads of glutes and loads of reductors, but my quads really didn't get that close to failure, and they didn't really grow very well from squats. Even I can take it a step further and do a high bar squat and really focus on knee flexion, but still even then wasn't great for me. So until I found other movements like hack squats, even Smith machine squats, leg press, they grew my quads better because I could really start taking the quads closer to failure, and that's incredibly important. But one of the other things I've changed, and I'm circling back to technical failure, I'll try not to ramble too long on all of these points, but I used to, if any little bit of technique would kind of go out of kind of almost perfect technique, I would call the set. So for example, on a squat, if my knees traveled in, I'd be pretty like close to wanting to re-rack it at that point. Or if I was doing a row and I like jerked a little bit, I'm like, I'm starting to jerk it. Momentum's not good for gains. I kind of leave it there. And so I have just redefined technical failure for myself, where I used to have this kind of very small window of acceptable technique and then technically it's broken. Now it's much wider. If I can keep producing reps and the target muscle is continuing to be the limiting factor, and I'm not generating obvious excess fatigue for this and it's safe, I will keep going. So you might look at some of my training now and be like, oh, your technique looks a bit rough compared to before. But the goal of technique for muscle growth is to do exactly as I said. Safely take a muscle as close to failure as you can for that exercise. It isn't about it looking picture perfect of straight up and down. Things have to slow down. I think about it this way, like anything that gets challenged, anything close to breaking point, there's going to be ruptures, and like it just looks a bit like less than pristine in that moment. And so long as you're not breaking down completely and causing risk for injury, I think it's a good thing to go, especially for isolation-based movements, where the risk is so little. Now, I wouldn't push as close to failure on something like a hip hinge or, again, a squat. I don't want to concentrically fail on those because it's quite risky. And I even learned that recently. I had a vlog that came out previously where I'd been taking my RDLs, or rather I was doing like a straight leg deadlift, and I'd take them very close to failure and my lower back went out a little bit. And I think maybe on lifts like that where the risk profile is higher, you don't want to take them and be as pushy with them that way. But certainly a lot of isolation-based lifts, machine-based lifts, and that's one of the benefits of machines, where you can really push yourself closer to failure. For example, with a Smith machine press versus dumbbells, where the dumbbells can they don't have the stability component you've got with the Smith machine. So anyway, essentially redefining failure for myself, rather than being a strict technical failure, more so trying to get towards momentary muscular failure for that muscle, and doing it in a safe way. However, second thing, I wouldn't like to say I was afraid of fatigue, but the thought goes, the closer you get to failure, there's exponential fatigue cost. And so you want to be careful not to push too close to failure because of that fatigue. And with that fatigue means you can't do as much volume, and you can't grow as much muscle. And so inevitably it caused a little bit of like, I want to make sure not to go too close to that because I could be cooked, and that won't provide the best results. But what that ended up doing is trying to stay away from it and almost being quote unquote afraid of that, afraid to hit kind of grindy reps, be like, oh no, that's going to cut short my progress. It was almost like actually going closer to failure was a negative thing versus a positive thing. Whereas now I'm much more like, hey, if I go push a bit too, I'd prefer actually to push a bit too hard than push too easy, because I don't think you can just make up for it via volume. I don't think I think you probably can, but the risk that you launch yourself into low quality sets and junk volume is there. Whereas if you push a bit too hard, you can always pull back. And you can always pull back on the next set. You can always pull back the next week. You can kind of work with that a little bit more. And also, fatigue generated from movements is one, individual to people, I think, to some extent, but it's also different exercise to exercise. So for example, I used to have kind of a blanket idea of I would have this many reps in reserve for like a week one out of a deload, and then just kind of progress from there. Whereas now, things like my calves, biceps, triceps, delts, isolation movements that are lower in fatigue cost and also risk cost, and also we're maybe not even as good at approximating our RARs for higher repetitions, and there seems to be more need to go closer to failure for high reps versus low reps, I will push those close to failure on average. So my average RAR for those might be like a 1 to 0, whereas for the bigger compound lifts, I might be at like more of a 2 to 1. So on average, I'm just pushing myself closer to failure as well. So yeah, essentially, I was maybe a bit too afraid of fatigue. Next up is something I'm kind of frustrated with myself about, because I thought my thought process behind deloading, I even had a roundtable which was fantastic with Mena Henselmans, Eric Helms, and Mike Israetel on deloads, where essentially they came to a joint, somewhat conclusion. They all deload slightly differently, that you should auto-regulate them. You shouldn't just have a paradigm of 4-to-1 deload every 5th week. And that is how I thought I was going about things, but I don't think I enough tested myself. Similar to how you might test yourself in terms of reps in reserve. You don't truly know what 3 RAR is unless you've taken something to failure. So you go to failure and now and then go there. Similar here, if you don't truly test the limits of how much fatigue can I deal with and keep going for, then you don't know how long you can go for. You maybe just accept, this is an amount of fatigue, I should probably deload. So I don't think it was necessarily a fault of my own. I just don't think I fully understood what, I fundamentally think that deloading, some people don't fully understand the role of it. It is a tool that is only useful if you need it. So when do you use the tool of the deload? When you have such a level of fatigue that you can no longer perform well, or you're not getting the feedback from your training that you should be getting, and essentially the global stimulus to fatigue trade-off is not in a good position. Like your performance might be just, I did this in my last mesocycle just now. I went for just over 8 weeks, dieting too, by the way, which is a long mesocycle for me. There's probably 3 weeks of like repeat performance. And that's a good repeat performance. It's 0 RAR with good levels of volume. It's a great stimulus to be holding on to. But I just found myself every week that first week I did it felt pretty decent. The next week I felt pretty good about it. The next week after that I was like, this feels like a grind. I'm feeling beat up. Like, it's good to pull back now versus needing to see like terrible performance to have to call it. I was having some of those signs of overreaching as well, with my sleep, with my mood, with motivation to train, with some niggles kicking in. So it just allowed me to focus more on that. And I think what allowed me to do a better job of auto-regulating my deload was not trying to force a deload. I think that was really the problem. It wasn't that I took a deload in week 6 just because. It was, I have a deload in week 6, so let's make sure I need it. So I earn that deload. And so I would make sure that I would push myself to failure on everything, but with so much volume that I forced a deload to occur. And I don't think that's the best route to go down, especially during diet phases, by the way, kind of forcing an overreach. Whereas even in a gaining phase, I'm like, hey, if we can stretch this mesocycle out for like, I don't know, 7-8 weeks, and we just don't add those 2 to 5 sets for a muscle group maybe that would force you to have to deload sooner, we can just continue to milk out this great stimulus for longer versus generate a crazy stimulus that we have to then deload for and then go again. Given the research on overreaching isn't overwhelmingly compelling, I just think it's better to reach this point of set volume and relative intensity that's really, really good, generating a great amount of stimulus, and kind of hold that for as long as you can. Allow then fatigue to just accumulate naturally, because if you don't deload, your body's going to deload for you, then you obviously will go through a deload. So that's something I've changed my perspective about, is not having like a specific paradigm and not forcing a deload to occur, if that makes sense. In line with deloading, it is this kind of matching performance idea. I used to think that if you match performance week on week, that was inevitably a negative thing, and that you should set up a mesocycle so every week you can see either an additional rep or an additional amount of weight. Whereas I don't think that was wise. I don't think that's absolutely necessary at all, and that repeating performance is completely fine. And in fact, if you're able to repeat performance, it could be done under higher levels of fatigue, because as you go through the mesocycle, you're accumulating more and more fatigue, more than likely, all things being equal, of course. So yeah, I used to have this kind of concern that if I was matching performance, that, hey, if I can only match this performance next week, why would I bother doing that? Let's deload and go again. Whereas now it's like, hey, if I can match this performance, this really good performance, by the way, that's great. If I can keep matching it, that means the fatigue isn't building up to a point that means I have to deload. So yeah, reframing matching performance is actually really great. And this is a fundamental issue I think that people misunderstand about progressive overload anyway, in that you have to meet a threshold of overload, which means you have to train hard enough with enough volume. They're kind of the thresholds I think of mainly. And so long as you're meeting that threshold, you're generating a growth response. So long as you're doing that, that's great. And you're not going to be able to hit new PRs every week. It's just not going to happen. It might not be every meso. It might be multiple mesos before you see a PR, depending on how advanced you are and how long you've been doing that lift. So bear those things in mind. So I now reframe matching performances. Hey, that was still a great quality set with generating quality stimulus, meeting thresholds for growth. Next one is not worrying so much about small little quirks or one-off things. So I would say sometimes you go and have a session, everything's great, but performance is just a bit down. If performance is a little bit down, it might be a rep, might be a couple of reps, might be a little bit of load. If it's just a little bit down and it's just a one-off, the rest of the week was really good, I don't worry about it at all. It's just a little bit of a quirk. I don't think you have to spend too much time having to worry about like having to pinpoint down why did that happen and obsessing about it. It doesn't really help. It could be anything. It could be that the machine used a different machine, like a different cable stack, for example, and one was slightly more oiled than the other one, or whatever it might be, you know. I don't think you have to over obsess about it. Of course, if you have a bad night's sleep and it happens, then you have like causation and correlation. It's probably that is what occurred, or if you missed your pre-workout meal or whatever. But sometimes these things happen, and then next week it could be completely fine. So long as it's not like, hey, it's in that muscle through multiple sessions through the week, if it's just a one-off and it's a small drop in performance, not like 50% drop in performance where you're half the reps for the same RER or what have you, for the same load, then I just don't worry about it. It's just like, hey, it's fine. These things happen, Maybe I actually control my eccentric a bit more on this rep. You try and standardize technique, right? But inevitably there's small little deviances that can lead to a rep exchange, for example. If your eccentric speed was a bit slower, for example, or you paused a little more, what have you. The other thing is like a one-off bad night's sleep. Just recently, unfortunately, was in A&E until, not for myself, but in A&E till 5 a.m. I normally go to bed at like 10 p.m. And so I was concerned, of course, as we would be. We know how important sleep is. But some people will look at that and be like, the next day, be like, man, what has my last couple of days of workouts been wasted? I haven't earned the muscle growth from those. And man, am I going to gain fat? Because I know nutrient partitioning is worse when you have poor sleep. And I just don't think about that at all now. I slept in a little bit because I can. I'm self-employed and I'm my own boss, and I had no meetings early. And then that night, I went to bed at my usual time and slept like a baby. Actually, I went to bed a little bit earlier than my usual time, and I really paid off that sleep debt. I continued to train. I trained that day. I was at the point where I was considering a deload anyway, but I was like, actually, no, I can still perform. Had a fine session. It wasn't the best session, but it was fine. And so I just think if there's like little things that are slightly off, like you have to train at a slightly different time, or your sleep is slightly off, it's nothing that you really need to stress about. The body is resilient. You are adaptable. You are not that weak thing that has to have everything optimized and perfect. Now, there are times where it's more important. I think towards like an end stage of contest prep, when you're in those last 5 pounds that you're trying to lose, if you're slightly off, you feel everything much more. You're much more resilient when you've got plenty more body fat and you're well fed. So it does vary a little bit, but I just say that like slight one-offs are nothing to be totally afraid of, and you can definitely take them on. So those are some of my fundamental changes with training. I'm on average training harder. I'm letting my technique look less perfect and pristine, but taking muscles closer to failure. And I'm more happy to just push hard training for longer and really test myself in terms of the level of fatigue I'm holding, not forcing deloads and things upon me, but taking it as it comes. And not stressing about small little deviances within training or life in general. And essentially not being a pussy, but actually just being much more resilient and knowing my body can take a beating and listening to it versus listening to textbook advice or what have you, and not being afraid. Like your body, again, is resilient, it's strong. You can push yourself real hard. And you'll soon learn if you push yourself too much, right? So yeah, that in a roundabout way has been one of my mindset shifts surrounding training, which I think has had a positive response in terms of my training, my physique outcomes. If you guys have gone through any of these yourself, or you have any in addition, or you disagree with anything I've said, love to hear your feedback. If you are still listening and you're not subscribed, definitely subscribe. It's always great to have more subscribers. Give me a comment if you've got any questions about anything. And I'll catch you in the next episode. Cheers.